speak to you. Like I said, I read the R.E.M. book. I finished it about a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Came out in Spanish towards the end of 2024. Is that about right?
I don't know. Yeah, sure. That sounds about right to me.
Well, in Spanish, it's called Este grupo se llama R.E.M. and it's published by Contra.
Okay.
So, and no, it works. It works very well in Spanish. So I wanted to start off, like, you've written books about Brian Wilson, Bruce Springsteen, Paul McCartney, and Paul Simon. So why R.E.M? Do you think they fit into this lineage?
Yeah, well, what's interesting to me about R.E.M. is how they managed to be simultaneously incredibly sort of innovative and artistic, in their pursuit of sound, songs and sounds that really no other pop band was exploring at the time. And yet, despite the fact that they were so stubbornly individualistic in their vision, they still managed to be incredibly successful, which is, puts me in mind of all those other artists. I mean, it's interesting to me that they feel less individually like transcendent cultural characters in the way that the Beatles and the Beach Boys and Bruce Springsteen and those people do. But I think that was largely by design on their part, because they were so staunch in the way that they divided their professional work and their professional identities from their actual personal lives. And so we know tons and tons about Bruce Springsteen's personal life. We know, so much about what was going on in the Beatles' personal lives. But the R.E.M. really, from the moment they began, their earliest interviews, were very, very strict about kind of keeping the media away from their actual personal lives, which in a sense, I think, preserved their sanity and kept them a lot more normal than other celebrity musicians. But on the other hand, I think it doesn't give people that same kind of personal, emotional connection that they have with other artists. So in a weird way, their music was transcendent, and connected with people, but there was still this, I don't want to say diffidence, but there was that separation. And so in a sense, you got to know the music so much better than the actual characters. But what was interesting to me, the other thing that sort of holds them together in a sense, or at least, connects them to those other artists, is how their music came to kind of feel like the soundtrack of their moment. They had that magical ability to kind of channel feelings and thoughts that people were having in the larger culture, and identify them and turn them into songs in a way that people just immediately and viscerally connected with.
Well, it's very interesting you say about their personal lives, because I love R.E.M. and I came to them quite late on in life, but I really love them. And reading your book, I realized I didn't know a lot about them. Like, I did not know that Michael Stipe's father was, in the Vietnam War and was like very high up in the US Army, which I found really interesting. I mean, was it hard? Was it hard for you to get that bit? I mean, the first 100 pages of the book basically are about Michael Stipe.
Well, Michael was always very, it took him about, 15 years after the band came together to feel comfortable enough with, his role in the media or his place as a celebrity to talk honestly or forthrightly about his sexual orientation, which is such a definitive part of him. And in a sense, that's not the traditional path that a celebrity takes. But on the other hand, I think it speaks well of him as a normal human being, because we just, the impulse of a healthy human is not to share their interior life with every single person who can hear the sound of their voice, which, and so it kind of, and that kind of reserve, which is which was shared by the other guys in the band. I mean, Peter Buck was married twice during the band, not just during the band's career, but at the height of the band's career, when they were at their absolutely most famous. And you never, as somebody who followed them in the media, you knew he was married, but they never talked about who it was to, or, what their relationship was like. I mean, there was a very kind of almost genteel division between work and life with them. And in a sense, I think that served them well as humans, but I think it's more difficult. I think it does, in a sense, kind of keep them, a little further away from an audience that sort of has this endless appetite for people's personal lives. I mean, look at the whole reality TV world. It's just where normal people get to become celebrities just because they'll say and do anything in front of a camera. Whereas R.E.M, we're like, yeah. We're going to make this music, and we really want you to listen to the music, but you're not going to be looking through our sock drawer.
Well, see, this is something I wanted to get onto later, because I've been wondering if a band like R.E.M could still emerge in 2025, because it's kind of impossible to keep that kind of detail out now. If you wanted to know if like Peter Buck was married or who he was married to, you could just find it easily.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think? Okay, what am I trying to like? Would that be a bad thing if like a new R.E.M, to put it in that way, came out? Would it be bad that we couldn't have that mystery?
Well, I think one of the things that is both a blessing and a curse of the new, the internet, and this kind of the way that, there's been that breakdown and division between the personal and the professional, and the fact, and art and biography, is, when I was a kid, and really first getting into pop music and pop culture in the 70s, there just wasn't a lot of information about people. It's like somebody's, would put out a record or something, and there might be a big interview with them in Rolling Stone or, the other magazines. But that was, but there would be nothing on television, because television didn't really cover pop music at the time. I mean, it did sort of grudgingly and very sparingly. And the mainstream media didn't do it. I mean, if a rock star showed up on the cover of Time or Newsweek, it was extraordinary. And there just wasn't, there weren't that many outlets. There might be an article in Rolling Stone, there might be something in Circus or Cream or, one of those other kind of pop culture journals. But, and in a sense, it could be frustrating, but on the other hand, it was also sort of lent a kind of romance to it, because there was mystery. You didn't really know what was going on, and you had to sort of piece it together. I used to be, maybe not too surprisingly, given the career I ended up with, but I used to pore over like record covers and dust jackets, and you would sort of read the liner notes just to try to get a glimpse of who these people were and where they came from and who their friends were and what they did with their life and their time. And so when an artist came to town, and you would, go to the venue, and the lights would go down and they would pop up on stage, it was like, oh my goodness, they actually are. It's like they're real, they're humans. Whereas now it's like, before somebody comes in, before Taylor Swift shows up in town, you already know everything about who she's dating now and who she broke up with last year. And, because that's just how, there's this endless consumption of personality and biography that people have come to expect.
Can I go slightly pop psychology for a second? I wonder if there is for you, in some way, a contrast, because on one hand you want to know everything about people. I mean, you write books about them, you've done journalism. On the other hand, I suspect, and I don't know you, but I suspect there's something you like about not knowing. Is that right? You like the mystery in a way?
Well, in a sense, yeah, there's something very appealing about mystery but again, I mean, I also have the curiosity / OCD aspect of any, seasoned / jaded reporter, where when presented with a mystery, you want to work it out, you want to get into it and figure out what's going on. And I've built a especially over the last 20 plus years as I've been writing biography, it's like that's my whole job. I mean, it's like this relentless kind of curiosity and attempt to kind of dig into the into the details and get deep into the weeds and see what you can come away with. And one of the things I found is that, especially with writing about musicians and rock and rock music people, is that there is so little, as we say, boots on the ground reporting about this. You can, just by being resilient and stubborn and having an idea about where you might want to start looking, you can come up with really fascinating things about artists and really get some insight into into their character and into the sort of the headwaters of their creative lives, just by trying to understand a little bit about who they were as children and what that experience was and what's actually going on in their lives. I mean, I try to limit myself to stuff that actually has some impact on the work itself. I try not to be gratuitous about the stuff that I learn or reveal or put into a narrative, because I feel like everybody deserves a certain level of privacy, even very, very famous people. So if something, my measure is, does it impact the work, or was it impacted by the work? So, if there's something that seems to have turned up in an artist's actual creation, or in the process that went into being a creative artist, then that's interesting to me. But in terms of like revealing the details, it's one thing to know somebody had a relationship with, person B, but I don't need to know, the actual vivid details of what was going on between them, unless it has some reflection on it. So I'm not going to write like a scene for scene, recounting of somebody's hot date, that went very, very wrong or very, very right. So there is a thin line there.
I was going to say, so R.E.M. weren't interviewed for the book, but they did help you out, right? They kind of helped you out with contacts. I mean, what do you think was their view on it? Was it a bit like, if you must, or were they quite happy about it, or?
I don't know what they were about it. I don't think they were terribly unhappy about it, but it was one of those paradoxical things where it was simultaneously frustrating, because of course it's great when someone trusts you and lets you in and kind of gives you access, and hopefully if they can then allow you access without attempting to have too much control over what's being said. But on the other hand, there was also something sort of gratifying about them still being exactly who they were when they started out. That there was like, yeah, that tracks, the fact that they were, because it's a very sensible decision to say, well, we were famous musicians for 30 plus years. We sold way more records than we ever thought. We made tons more money than we ever imagined we could. And it was fun and, hard work and satisfying. And now that's over. And we emerged, on the other side. And there's no point in still trying to be super famous. They'll come out and talk about specific projects when those things come out, like the anniversary box sets, or, this new thing or that, whatever's coming out into the marketplace. But in terms of needing to go back and talk about their personal experience of their careers, they were like, no, like, what's the point in that? It's like, there's so much more fun stuff to do. And we don't need, they don't need the money. They don't need the exposure. So it's like, why do that? That's ridiculous. And as a person, as a relatively normal human, my reaction was, that's really smart. Like, I really admire that. Like, and that's actually part of the reason why I'm writing this book, is because they have that grasp on their humanity. That's what makes them worth writing about, is the fact that they don't want to be written about, which is a weird paradox, but there it is.
Was it a hard book to write for that reason?
It wasn't, I mean, okay, I'll tell you, yeah, it was a hard book to write, but I'll tell you why. It's because I felt, not because they didn't personally cooperate, because I did get a lot of information from people who, about them. And again, there was that, um, a level of cooperation in that they didn't try to stop me from talking to anybody. And when someone would ask them, is it okay if I talk to this guy? They would say, yeah, because they were aware of me, and, I've known their manager, and I know Peter Buck, and, and have for years. And so I think there was a level of, they thought, well, this is a legit guy that's not going to come and write a tabloid story about us. And so they were thinking like, okay, that's fine. Just let him do what he's going to do. But the fact that they didn't talk to me sort of was like resonated with the initial concept that I had for the book, which is that these are guys who are probably not going to talk to me,
Yeah.
because they're not like typical rock stars. They're not still needing to have that sort of huge external affirmation, because they got all that, and they've, and it filled them up, and they're fine.
I wanted to ask about the writing style. Now, obviously, I've only read the book in Spanish, but I don't think that necessarily changes what I want to ask about. You have a kind of style in a lot of things. So, for example, when you're talking about the first REM gig that they played at the church, 1980, if I remember rightly.
Yep.
And it feels like you're not claiming you were there, but it feels like you're almost writing yourself there. You're saying like, I think Peter Buck went off to vomit before, it kind of feels like you're describing something you were at without you actually claiming you were there, if that makes sense. Like, is that a fair way of describing this style?
Well, I try to make it visceral, I mean, for me, what makes something feel like good, vivid writing is that sense of being in scene. You want to kind of, what I'm trying to communicate is the feeling of the moment and what it was like to be in the room or to be the people who were there. In order to really describe that scene, I talked to like a dozen or more people who were actually there. Some of them, played with other bands. Some of them were just in the crowd, part of, sort of among the group of friends who were in the church. And so I could tell that story from, essentially, a dozen different angles, because, I talked to one of the people who was in, or a couple of people who were in the Side Effects, the other band that premiered that night. I talked to, a couple of the musicians from Pylon who were there just at the party, who saw the whole thing happen, and all these other folks. And it was like, plus there are written accounts from, that have come out over the years from different people. And so between all of that, it was almost like you got the sense of like, there were a dozen cameras here, and they all recorded what happened. And of course, everybody, everyone's memory tells the story in a different way. But I feel like it's, as a writer and as a reader, I feel like it's really important to write about, to write about these things and make people understand the feeling of what was happening at the moment. I don't want to get bogged down into endless recapitulations of recording sessions and when they added the slide guitar or when they took out the strings or whatever, and in the 17th take, he finally got the riff right. It's like, well, congratulations, but I'm way more interested in like whatever sense of desperation or creative inspiration went into the moment, as opposed to, the kind of infinitesimal differences between one take and the next. Everything to me is a human experience. It's somebody engaging in something and walking into a moment with, some set of needs and some set of frustrations and some set of fantasies and ambitions, and how those things all come together to kind of build this, in order to create this moment. Does that make sense? I mean, I understand what you're saying, and it can be, I think, for a certain type of reader, it's like, wait a second, how did this guy know all this? He wasn't there at the time. But at the other hand, it's like, well, look at the, you know, it's like everything that I write about, like this happened and that happened, is fueled by multiple accounts. And hopefully, you know, if somebody really wanted to dig in, I mean, I've written some books where there's very elaborate notes that describe exactly where each assertion came from. And this time, I mean, I've sort of relaxed a little bit in documenting that, but it's all, I think anybody who looks at the acknowledgments and sees the number of people who were interviewed and whose voices went into it, you can kind of figure out, like, there's a lot of different voices here.
I think that was the thing with me. Like, basically, I trusted you. You know, I didn't need someone going, and then, you know, the guitarist from Pylon said he saw Peter Buck being sick. You know, it's like,
right.
That was behind it, if you know what I mean. And then
Yeah.
it's like, well, I trust him, so I'm gonna go with it. But actually, this is interesting, because another thing I really enjoyed in the book is, like, for example, that first gig, which is obviously really important. You give a long, lengthy account of that gig, and you kind of like paint a real picture of it. And then, for example, the band's last album, Collapse Into Now, a record that I personally don't really like, but it's not here or there. It was covered in about 10 pages. And
Right.
I was sort of glad in that, because I think if you'd been like, you know, and then they did take X on fifth song or Collapse Into Now, I'd probably like, yeah, I don't know.
Right.
I mean, okay. How do you feel about Collapse Into Now, I suppose? do you like?
Well, that record, I like. There's no, I like. It's not bad. It's not terrible. It's like, if it's on, I'll listen to it and I'll go like, hey, it's R.E.M. I love R.E.M. I love the sound of this guy's voice. I like the textures they're coming up with. I like the fact that there is clearly some artistic ambition here. That's the only record of theirs that feels to me like, oh, they're really trying to be R.E.M. in this moment. And it was almost like different songs revisited different moments in their career. And there's one song on that album that I think stands with everything they ever did, Discoverer, which I think is the opening. I can't remember if that's the opening track, but it's perfect. It's beautiful. And it's the most explicitly autobiographical song, you know, Michael Stipe, or lyric that Michael Stipe ever wrote. It's very much about his experience and of being an R.E.M. and the moment when he began to realize that something was going to happen for him and how exciting it was. And he describes it in, you know, typically sort of elliptical ways, but you know exactly what he's talking about. There's other songs on there that are less good. One of the challenges of being a biographer and writing about people, you know, writing about that sort of traditional career arc, is that the front half of the story, the struggle and the rise and the discovery of, you know, an artist's voice and identity and then the challenges that went into that, and then the moments of triumph are that, you know, that's the exciting part. But then if an artist has a long career, chances are there's a very, very long second half of the career, which is where they've figured out who they are and what they do, and everything is kind of smooth. And sometimes, you know, there can still be great work that comes out of it that's fascinating to read about, because there's still a struggle that goes into it. But on the other hand, the story starts to become a little familiar. You begin to feel like, are they going through the motions here? And so therefore the reader is way less interested in that part. So how do you, as a writer and storyteller, how do you gracefully tell that part of the story without overdoing it? Because really, who cares that much? You know, I mean, no one is going to care as much about the making of Collapse Into Now as they care about the making of Out of Time, you know, or Green, or the early records, where it was like, this was the moment when they really finally figured this out. And this was the struggle to get to that place, as opposed to, and this is when everything was running smoothly, you know, and they could kind of, you know, and it, you know, even when the records that work, they work in a way that's less exciting in a sense, because it's not about like that eureka moment of discovery.
But I like that fact. I mean, would it be fair that is what I said fair? Did you think, okay, I don't need to do that much on this record. There's not that much to say, so I'm quite happy to leave it at 10 pages or whatever.
Well, but it's just, yeah, I mean, it makes sense in terms of narrative because the record was less, in a way, it was less consequential because there was just no, because it didn't sell as many copies. It didn't like, you know, it didn't make a huge impact in the culture when it came out, other than the fact that it was going to be their last record. It wasn't one of these things where it's like everybody was like, oh my goodness, like, in the way that really from like the mid 80s through the late 90s, all their albums were like, they hit in a big way. People, you had to kind of stop and watch what was going on. Peter talks about the moment when they came out to play that Tibet show, the benefit, and it was the first show they played without Bill Berry. And they were making they were in the middle of making Up, which was a very electronic, very out of character record for them. And they were consciously trying to reinvent themselves. And he talked about when they came out on stage, like all the other artists were on the side of the stage watching, waiting to see what R.E.M. was going to do now, because it was important, because they were one of the definitive artists of the moment. So 15 years later, not so much. Yeah. I mean, but Peter would tell you that. It's like, and he said, like, the one thing he misses about being in R.E.M. was being at the center of the culture. So it's those moments when an artist is at the center of their culture that is the important part of the story. After that, when it boils down and they're professionals doing a good job and, and being great entertainers, as it were, which is a diminishing way to refer to somebody, but so I apologize. But nevertheless, it's like, that's just less interesting. It's like I wrote, the big biography I did about Bruce Springsteen goes into incredible detail about the early stuff and struggles along the way. But by the time you get to the 21st century and he's making really strong records, boom, 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 they're still not shaking up the world in the same way. So the making of, Magic, the Springsteen record that came out in 2007 is way less compelling to people than the making of Born to Run. Or Born in the USA, for obvious reasons, because that 2007 record, it's a really strong record. I really love that record, but it didn't, shake things up in the way that the other records did.
You graduated high school in 1981, I believe.
Yep.
So did R.E.M. come at the perfect time for you?
Well, they would have done had I been paying attention. But I was they came from the Southeast and I was living in the Northwest at the time. So I'm a long way away. And given we were talking earlier about the differences in the media between the early 80s and now, and one of the significant differences was that there was regional culture at the time. And so there could be a band that was making a lot of waves and getting a lot of attention in one part of the country that you wouldn't have heard about elsewhere. And so in my part of the world, I was aware of them because I read Rolling Stone and I read a lot of, these other magazines, and I was aware, I'm sure I probably stumbled across their work, but those early records weren't as important to me in that moment. I caught up with them more when they sort of hit mainstream media in the mid and late 80s, because there was only mainstream media where I was. And so therefore, and I didn't have like a cooler older brother or a cooler, friends who knew, who had hipper tastes than me, which is terrifying if I was the hippest person in the room at any given time in the 80s, because I was not hip at all. But nevertheless, so by the time I really focused on them and they really made an impact on me, it was like the second half of the 80s. And they were at the beginning of that moment where they became where they really got to a point of channeling the greater culture. And at that point, I was like in my late 20s and then early 30s, but it was still kind of perfect in the sense that I was beginning to understand how the world worked and how government worked and how all these things kind of wove together. And they were doing such a great job of describing that in the context of pop music. And that was great. I mean, when I saw them in the mid 90s, you know, on the Monster tour, there was this incredible feeling of, you know, when they came out on stage of, this is the pop culture of the moment, and it's happening here in this room right now. And it was a very, you know, it was a very idealistic moment. It was a real sort of, there was a great surge of progressive thought, and you know, and it was exciting because that was sort of, you know, those were my politics. That was my moment, in a sense. But it did take me a while to get into it.
And your favorite R.E.M. album?
Automatic for the People, which is from exactly that moment that I'm describing. But it's a very, very beautiful, very dark, but hopeful, and very, you know, it's just the way that it has. They were at that point where their willingness to experiment and to use instruments that people didn't use, and write songs about things that people tended not to write songs about, and somehow magically, you know, turn a weird, you know, cryptic meditation on Andy Kaufman into a generational anthem. You know, it was like, oh, like, this is terrific. Like, it reminded me of the Beatles, really. You know, that ability to take you know, to sort of take unlikely things and combine them into this kind of uncannily perfect art, you know, that resonated with, you know, tens of millions of people around the world. You know, that to me was really, you know, that was the kind of transcendent moment for me.
So I remain convinced that Shiny Happy People is one of R.E.M's very best songs. And that is a hill I will die on. Am I right, or am I an absolute idiot?
No, listen, I don't hate that song, and I don't understand the people who do. I think it's a charming little pop song. And it's a little silly, but a lot of their best stuff is a little silly. I mean, one of the things that makes R.E.M. so fascinating and so fun is the fact that they, you know, their influences went from the Velvet Underground and Patti Smith to the Monkees and the Archies. I mean, they all love that kind of silly pop music stuff, because there's something very sort of life-affirming about it in a way. So in a song like that, which has this beautiful pop hook to it, you know, Michael felt inspired to write a song about shiny, happy people. So and I guess I don't see the point in, you know, people, especially your serious R.E.M. fans, really sort of have this idea that, well, it's got to be dark, it's got to be kind of cryptic and strange, and so far off beat that, you know, 80% of the people who hear this will have no idea what's happening. And I get that. I like that kind of music too. But on the other hand, it's like, I like Pop Confections, you know, it's like, there's nothing wrong with this. People, and this idea that there's this aggressive loathing of that song, I just think is ridiculous. I mean, it's a weird song in its way. I mean, rhythmically, it's all over the map. There's, you know, the instrumentation is interesting. It's got that great jangling riff at the center of it. It's like, you know, and also this idea that there is an objective good and bad in any kind of art. I just don't buy that. I mean, it's like things hit people's ears in different ways. So it's like, if that's the thing, if that's your favorite R.E.M. song, then it's the best R.E.M. song as far as you're concerned, and that's what matters to you. So I'm not going to tell you that you can't, like, oh, well, you should be ashamed. It's like, no, it's fine. It's great. I'm glad, you know, it's like, there's you know, every single R.E.M. song is probably somebody's favorite R.E.M. song. And each person is right for themselves. And maybe if they can, you know, maybe if they just told you what they love about it, their passion would convert you. You know, it gives you an angle into the song you hadn't heard, you know, you hadn't had before.
One day I'm going to write a very big thing about shiny, happy people. But, you know.
Good. I'd be down for, I'm there for that.
All right. Another particularly annoying question. I'm sure you've been asked this many a times, but do you think R.E.M. will ever reform? Because I got to say, it feels to me a bit like we need them. 2025. It's not the not the happiest of times.
No, it's not. And they're, and one of their strengths was being able to kind of find and even create light through dark times. So yeah, it feels like it would be a very good time for REM to reform. But then the question is, do they have the appetite for it? I mean, these bands that get back, I mean, in a way, so much of what they did and so much of their identity was about not doing the stuff that every other, musician does. I mean, I think the first line in the book is, even from the start, you would know them from their refusals. And there's this huge litany of stuff that they were asked or told to do and they wouldn't do. And it's a lot of it is very fundamental rock musician stuff. Like, of course you're going to do this. Of course you're going to do that, because you have to make a video. You have to lip sync. You have to make, agree to have strings overdubbed onto your song so that it plays better on the radio. You have to do a certain amount of conforming, and they were, very rigid, or, certainly their boundaries would evolve over time as they, developed as artists and came to see different possibilities. But on the other hand, this sense of, like, especially when it came to just kind of commercial moves, like they're not like they could have, like when they broke up in 2011, they could have done a huge global tour, and that would have been hundreds of millions of dollars for them. Saying, this is it, we're done, this is our farewell tour. Those things sell huge. It's your last chance to see REM. Everybody goes. But they were like, nah. And in the same way, it's like a band that broke up 10 or 15 years ago. And then, especially if all the members are alive and still talking to each other, it's the natural move is to get back together at some point. And people do it because they need the money. People do it because they miss the rush of fame. And I think also, as an artist, you really enjoy, you begin to realize, like, this really worked. Like, this was me in some ways at my best. And and I think especially one of the things I hear from, from veteran artists who then get back together is, well, now my kids are old enough to understand what I did, and I kind of want them to see, what I was like when I was really at the top of my game. The idea that your kids are teenagers or in their 20s, and suddenly they can come to the venue and there's, mom or dad or whoever, and tens of thousands of people are going bananas. I think that's fun, for somebody. It's like, you want your kids to experience you when you're sort of at your height. But I don't think that doesn't seem to appeal to them at this point.
Damn it.
And yeah, right. I mean, in a level, I would totally applaud and defend if they decided to go, well, actually, on second thought, we are going to play together again. I would love that. I would absolutely love that. But if they say, well, actually, we're going to stick with our initial promise to never do that because we're just not into it, it's not important to us, I would love that too, because I would admire it. I mean, I do admire it. They're sticking to who they are.
Peter Ames Carlin, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you so much. As I said, the book came out in Spanish. Este grupo se llama R.E.M. and in Contra, very fine local publisher. Get it in English, get it in lots of other languages as well.